Today, on this episode of the Going Deeper podcast, we are launching into a new series where we're talking about specifically this book here, Altered by Susan Kent, and the worship series that we're doing here at Trinity Methodist Church. We're going to be talking today specifically about altars from the Old and the New Testament and how they still apply to our lives today and what we can do with that information and that knowledge as we approach worship today. I'm your host, Kyle McCaskill.
I'm Brian Yike.
I'm Doug DeGraffenried.
So join us as we go deeper. Well, Doug, you want to kind of give us a brief introduction, I guess, or lead us into this conversation. So I'm going to turn things over to you here. So take it away, Doug.
Over the period of Lent, we're doing a sermon series entitled Altered, where we're looking at the altars in the Old Testament, the sacrifices that were made on those altars, and we're going to look into our own lives about where the altars are in our own soul. And this will lead us to Palm or Passion Sunday, where on an altar called the cross, Jesus sacrificed himself, and understanding his sacrificial atonement has to be done within the fullness of the revealed text of the Old Testament. So Methodist, for the next 5 or 6 weeks, we're going to be in the Old Testament. The first mention of an altar ever, as I said in the message Sunday, is Noah after the ark has landed, and it's from the 8th chapter of the book of Genesis. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took every clean animal and every clean bird and burnt offerings he offered there on the altar. And the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. And what you see in that passage is that what goes on at an altar influences the unfolding of history, and you might say influences the will of God. And we'll probably grapple with some of that as we look at some of these altars. So what Brian and I are going to do in these sessions is almost a supplement. It's talking in depth about some of the places where Scripture talks about altars and sacrifices.
Okay. So I guess for those of us that maybe not be really familiar with some of these stories, because some of them are, deep Old Testament stories that we're going to cover. What really historically and biblically is that significance of an altar? And what were the implications for the people who were building them? Was it a, let me remember this, let me honor God, or is it kind of a yes, both and? What?
The building of the altar is interesting because there is a motif through Scripture that I'll call stacking stones. Stones were used to mark property. Stones were used to mark a place that we need to remember something.
Like in the middle of the Jordan.
Yeah, the middle of the Jordan, the 12 rocks are stacked where the priest went into the Jordan with the Ark of the Covenant, and the waters parted and they stood there on the dry. And you can trace this stone stacking all the way to the New Testament, where Jesus said, and you are Peter, and upon a rock like you, I'm going to stack my stones. So we as the church then, and think about this, we as the church become the altar. And in Romans, what are you? You're a living sacrifice.
Living sacrifice, yeah.
So this is what Brian and I are going to try to do is tie up New Testament and Old Testament, because it's a rich image that is all throughout Scripture, that these altars call us to remember what happened there. They call us to remember how lives and directions were changed. And there's actually even a dark side to these altars that get built, because what happens is the Hebrews will start building altars to the other team.
Oh, yeah.
And we have this whole notion of breaking down the altars. So, from a pastoral point of view, sometimes we build altars and we put our idols on our altars. Mm-hmm. And so it's a rich imagery. It's full of life and truth, and it's going to be fun to unfold it. That was my head going down, meaning I've talked too much.
No. I think I think this is such a helpful image when you think about not only the altar but the sacrifices that are made, and I think in a lot of ways it points to our relationship with God. It points to how do we relate to God, and how, especially in the Old Testament, how do I relate to a God who is so other than I am, who is so holy, who, I've been reading through Genesis, Exodus, now I'm starting in Leviticus, reading through the Bible in a year, and just remembering, don't even step on this mountain, because if you do, zap, because He is so holy and we're not. And to go with Doug's example, it didn't take long for the Hebrews coming out of Egypt to say, well, Moses is taking way too long to come down off of this mountain, so let's build our own little altar and let's build a golden calf, and because we can't wait for Moses. And so I think that's right. I think there's this struggle. How do we relate to God? And then in that struggle, sometimes we try to create our own ways that are inconsistent with Scripture, or inconsistent with God's character. Looking at the other team, to use your words, and that's where we really get off.
Mm-hmm. And so the altars in general, whether we're talking the Israelites or the other religions that were around, they were known and understood in the time as being places of sacrifice.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that was,
whether it was a Canaanite altar or the altar for the Hebrews,
And so we carry that, I guess, that notion, that mentality still today, because like Doug, like you said, in Romans, we're living sacrifices. Mm-hmm. And so this whole series being based around this, the idea of altered, it implies that we need that continual living sacrifice. Mm-hmm. We need to be that. And I really, I just like the thing on the bottom of the book that we have, the transforming power of surrender.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's an important aspect for us as we are on this journey towards Lent.
Mm-hmm. I was in a church a couple of weeks ago, a church of another flavor, and there's nothing like being invited to a worship service on a Sunday afternoon, and the worship service went on for 2 hours. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't a Methodist worship service. And I walked in the church and I told the usher, I'm a visitor, obviously, and I don't want to sit on anybody's seat, so I'm going to go sit on the front row, because I know nobody in a church sits on the front row. And I was sitting there on the front row, and I was noticing the architecture, because I always look at other people's stuff. And this church had an altar table down on the floor, the pulpit up behind it, the choir behind that, the baptistry behind that. We're ascending. But what I noticed in their architecture, and it's, as I thought about the church of my baptism, it's true, there was no place to kneel. And it just stood in stark contrast to both of our worship spaces here at Trinity, that I can, at the end of the service, can call people up to kneel to receive communion, or I can call them up to pray after communion, or I can call them up to kneel to pray just on general principles. But it's this notion that approaching an altar does involve surrender.
Yeah.
And I was trying to ferret out architecturally, what's the church saying that they have all these vestiges or all these symbols of Christianity that are holy and sacred to them and to me, but there's no place to surrender. And it, as we're evolving worship here at Trinity and trying to grow our gifts and graces in that area, how do we in a worship service surrender ourselves to God? At what moment does that surrender take place? It can take place in a pew, it can take place in a seat, it can take place standing, but I think these symbols remind us of some of these theological truths that a holy God calls us to approach Him on His terms, not ours.
Yeah.
And to surrender ourselves and our will. That prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So our whole culture is built around what has now become a foreign concept, surrendering ourselves to God and to His will.
Yeah.
Well, and in a conversation that was happening outside of this that we were a part of yesterday, Doug, one of the thoughts, because you mentioned worship services, one of the thoughts that came into my mind is, well, when we come in to worship, what should we be expecting? We should not be expecting, God, what are you going to do for me? Right. Although there are times in a worship service that God absolutely works on things in us that need to be worked on.
Yeah.
But this act of worship that we're doing, much like when you build an altar in the Old Testament, ancient Near East, that you are coming to worship, it is not because, God, what are you going to do for me? Right. It is, you are such a holy God that I can't help but want to be in your presence and offer to you anything that I have.
Right. Yeah.
Our word worship comes from an Old English word, worthship. And literally, the act of worship is showing God and showing others what He's worth in our life, His value to us. And He has intrinsic value, but He's God and we're not. But
Thank goodness.
We forget that sometimes.
We do. And again, they should have podcast our conversation yesterday with a worship guru, because so much of worship today, and I'm going to get in trouble with this, so much of worship today has become transactional. It's not transformational, and we treat worship in some places, and I've been guilty of it too, we treat worship like a therapy session with songs.
Yeah.
And it's not about us. It's not about our needs, our wants, our desires, our hurts, our pains. It's all about God. And when we make that leap, when we learn to experience that leap, that's when the transformation takes place. I mean, look at what Noah's been through. He's been on that boat. He's been on that boat with all those animals, and I want to talk to Noah and ask him why in the word he put love bugs and mosquitoes and some of the varmints on that boat. But he's been on that boat, and the boat lands, and Noah and his family and the animals are basically starting all over. Creation redone. And the first thing he does is build an altar. So what would happen if we approached worship that the first thing we wanted to do, rather than take our seat, will be to go to the altar and give ourselves to God.
Yeah.
How would our worship change? How would we change if that was our first move?
Yeah. And I've experienced kind of that I guess you'd say the two extremes, maybe. Well, maybe not two extremes, but so when I grew up in the Methodist Church, and our worship services were never all that lively. And
Same here.
And it was, but I mean, people were, they were good people, and they were there to worship God, but the singing was kind of, some people would sing out, and many people wouldn't, but I went to seminary and went to chapel for the first time, and heard, and it was it was like what I grew up with, a very traditional service. There was no band, but you could just feel in the room this movement toward God, and this focus that we are here to worship the living God. We're not here to do anything else. That is why we're here. And a couple of years after that, I read Robert Weber's book called "Worship is a Verb," and that's what I experienced. Is that here were people who were worshiping. They weren't being worshipped, or I guess the wrong word, but they weren't consuming worship on Sunday. They were giving worship. They were giving, on the altar. They were offering, thanks to God and honor to God because of what He's done. And it reminds me, I have a mentor that often says, what if we came on Sunday morning not to receive something, not to get recharged, but to just lay out and give to God all that we are and who we are, and thanks for what He's done, and what a difference that would be in the atmosphere of a worship service.
And maybe that mentality that has become very, I guess, pervasive in our Christian culture of I come to worship to be recharged is because maybe when we come to worship, we're not laying everything down that we should. And so we leave worship still carrying all that the garbage that we came in with because we haven't surrendered it. And so
it's true.
That I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's I think that's true. I think we come, and it's like we were never there in some cases, and I have to admit, I mean, I've been in that place myself, come into worship and forget that I'm here to worship. I've got everything else on my mind. I've got, worries or whatever, and forget that, in the midst of this, I can lay this down before the Lord and say, God, I don't know what to do with this, but here it is, and I want to honor you, and I want to worship you, and I've got some stuff that I need to get rid of too. So here it is. It's all of it,
Well, Brian, before this recording, you sent us the image of all these altars and the offerings and sacrifices. That I can share a link to this in the show notes. That way, people can have this to look at as well. Hopefully, but as we move through the next few weeks, and we're talking about the very specific offerings that we have, I guess, and Doug, you have as much knowledge about this as anybody because you're doing most of the sermons. Is there kind of a progression in how we're approaching these offerings? Because obviously we're getting closer and closer to Good Friday than Easter, of course, which is ultimately where we're headed, because we don't stop at Good Friday. But we've got these offerings that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be thinking about what we're doing, and I'm just curious how those, because we're so far removed from this sacrificial system. I guess,
it's going to be fun to unpack. Obviously, I've looked ahead, and I know what the sermons are, and some of my favorite Old Testament passages are a part of this, and some Old Testament passages I've avoided on purpose are a part of this. And, when we tackle Genesis 22, everybody who's ever been to seminary knows Genesis 22 and Abraham.
Yeah. Isaac.
The whole Abraham and Isaac and going to sacrifice Isaac on the altar. And so that's not a cheery text to preach, but it has some surprises within the text. So we're going to be with the text. We're going to let the text be with us and look at the altars, but also look at the sacrifices. I think our new youth director, Lori Spangler, who is also a soon-to-be seminary graduate, is preaching, and she's doing the prophets of Baal.
Oh, that'll be fun.
And I almost swapped with her, but I want to see what she does with the text. So we've got lots of voices coming to this, and then these podcasts will be sometimes they will follow the sermon that's been preached, and sometimes we'll introduce other concepts. We just want to be helpful.
Okay.
As we stand before the altar of God and see what He wants to do in our lives.
Okay. I think there's really not much more that we need to cover. This is probably one of the shortest ones that we're going to do in this series because this really is kind of this introductory series, kind of setting the tone, I guess, for the weeks ahead and this season that we find ourselves in. So I guess with that, we're pretty much at the end here, and if you're still listening, which I hope you're still listening, that you haven't tuned us out at this point, that I would recommend to you go ahead and give us a like and a subscribe and a follow or whatever it is on any of the podcast platforms that you tune into, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube or whatever. So anything positive that you can do with this, go ahead and make sure you do that now, because we think that what we've got going on here is very impactful. It's not just transactional, that it can be transformational, and that we hope that you have gotten something out of this and we can continue to maybe shine a light into your life just a little bit. So with that, we'll see you next time, and thanks for listening.